What we've done so far in this lecture is pretty significant. It's actually a lot of material that we've covered. What we've done is to provide a complete representation of what the economy's equilibrium will look like. We've shown there are various ways of doing this. One can think of equilibrium either as being in terms of withdrawals and planned injections being equal to each other, or one could think of equilibrium in terms of planned aggregate expenditure being equal to GDP. They're both really just different ways of saying the exact same thing. And we've also established that there are automatic forces in the economy that ensure the economy actually is at its equilibrium. And here the assumption that firms respond to any disequilibrium, that is, to any unplanned changes in their inventories, in a way that takes the economy back to equilibrium. So equilibrium is where we expect the economy to be. What I now want to do is address the question, how does this relate to the business cycle? Or more precisely, how does this relate to the creation of output gaps? Remembering that an output gap is a situation where the economy's actual GDP differs from the economy's potential GDP. So I want to start with the following. Let's suppose it just happens to be the case that the economy's equilibrium coincides with its potential GDP. So I want to start from a situation where there is no output gap. So you can see this illustrated in the diagram here. The economy's equilibrium corresponds to Y star. Y star is our notation for the economy's potential flow of GDP. The output gap here is 0. Now this is an equilibrium. The economy is at rest. There is no reason to expect that this situation would change. That is, there's no reason that this should change unless there is some exogenous change that is then imposed on the economy. Something happening external to the model that disturbs the economy and leads to changes. So what would be an example of an exogenous change? Well, an example that Keynes in the general theory emphasised a lot was the possibility of a revision to firms' planned investment. And Keynes thought this was pretty crucial to understanding the existence of output gaps. Remember that within this model we actually don't have an explanation for why this might occur. This is completely exogenous to the model. But Keynes himself thought that these changes to planned investment were a very significant feature of modern economies. And he attributed that to the fact that investment is such a forward-looking economic variable. We've talked about this before, how investment decisions made in the current period are actually made on the basis of what firms think might be the state of the economy in some future period. It's very hard to know what that might be. So Keynes thought that firms' investment decisions were not necessarily grounded in a very sort of scientific analysis of what the future might hold, but were very much subject to business people's expectations, feelings, gut feeling perhaps, about what the future might have in store, and that those sorts of calculations, those very subjective calculations, can be quite variable. So business people might wake up one morning, for example, and for whatever reason start to feel pessimistic about the future and think, well, maybe this isn't such a good time to be engaging in large-scale investment, and therefore they downsize their planned investment spending. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be any reason, anything going on there external to the model that has led to a downward revision in planned investment. What we want to do is see how we can analyse such an exogenous change in the context of this particular model. So to repeat, we're starting from a point of no output gap, where the equilibrium coincides with the economy's potential. We then introduce an exogenous change, in this case, a fall in planned investment. What happens? In the first instance, that will show up in planned injections. Remembering planned investment is one of the components of planned injections. The economy's planned injections line will therefore shift downwards. Now, it might take you a little while to get used to looking at diagrams like this and working out exactly what's going on. The way to think about it, and I think this is helpful, is to start labelling bits of the diagram so you can keep track of, the beginning point and what happens next. So our beginning point, and let's start with withdrawals and planned injections. Let's call our beginning point point A. After the exogenous fall in investment, the relevant point that relates to planned injections is no longer point A, but is point B. As far as planned injections are concerned, we have moved from point A to point B. As far as withdrawals are concerned, however, we are still at point A. Nothing's happened to withdrawals. Indeed, nothing has yet happened to the economy's income. Firms are still producing Y star. That hasn't changed yet. The only change at this point in our story is a fall in planned investment, a downward movement of the planned injections line. So the only difference is planned injections, the relevant point on planned injections is now point B. But straight away you can see we're now in a disequilibrium. We're now clearly in a disequilibrium because we have an imbalance between withdrawals and planned injections. Now, the fact that planned injections have fallen has implications for planned aggregate expenditure because, of course, planned injections is such an important component of planned aggregate expenditure. Planned aggregate expenditure also shifts down. It will shift down in line with the fall in planned injections. The economy, if you like, now operates according to a new, lower planned aggregate expenditure line. This line here, which I've labelled PAE1. And again, let's label where we started and where we're going. Our original equilibrium, let's call it point A prime. That point, however, no longer corresponds to where we are in terms of planned aggregate expenditure because planned aggregate expenditure has fallen to B prime. Now, I repeat, nothing has yet happened to production. There hasn't been time for that to adjust yet. So in terms of production, it's still Y star. In terms of planned aggregate expenditure, however, we are now at a point B star, which is below A star. So again, this is a situation of disequilibrium. We now have an imbalance between firms' production and the economy's planned aggregate expenditure. Firms are overproducing relative to what the economy wishes to purchase. Well, we have a story about what happens in circumstances like this. The story is that disequilibrium will not persist. Firms will adjust their production. Firms are observing an unexpected increase in their inventories. Firms, therefore, cut back on production. So the economy's GDP starts to fall, the economy's income starts to fall. Two things happen in response. First of all, the the economy's withdrawals move in line with the fall in income. So we get reductions in saving, taxation and imports, and that's shown by a movement down and along the withdrawal schedule. Households cut back on their consumption, and hence the economy's planned aggregate expenditure is further reduced, this time not as a downward shift in planned aggregate expenditure, but as a movement down and along planned aggregate expenditure. This is just the story we told before about how the economy transitions to a new equilibrium if it finds itself overproducing relative to planned aggregate expenditure. When do these movements stop? When we reach the new equilibrium. Once we reach the new equilibrium, let's call it point C in terms of withdrawals and the new lower level of planned injections. Let's call it point C prime in terms of the new lower planned aggregate expenditure and output. Once we reach those points, this process stops, the economy is at an equilibrium. And let me call that equilibrium YE, E for equilibrium, and let's call it 1. So this is actually pretty significant what you're observing here. What you're observing here is a very systematic piece of economic analysis that explains the emergence of a contractionary output gap. The economy is now producing a flow of GDP below its potential. It's producing a flow of GDP below its potential because there has been an exogenous change. In this instance, an exogenous fall in planned investment, pulling planned injections down, pulling planned aggregate expenditure down, creating disequilibrium, creating firms adjusting via lowering production, leading to a new equilibrium below potential. What you're looking at is a recession. Note the following. That new equilibrium is clearly endogenous. We've reached the new equilibrium because of what's happened within the model. Our model has explained why that new equilibrium has been reached. It's endogenous because it has responded, GDP has responded to the exogenous change in planned aggregate expenditure. Where does the contractionary output gap really come from? It's come about because the economy's potential GDP has not changed. That's still Y star. That's exogenous. It's determined by factors completely outside of this model, none of which have changed. It's the endogeneity of the economy's equilibrium and the exogeneity of the economy's potential output that is really at the heart of this Keynesian explanation for recessions. That's a really important and quite profound insight. And prior to Keynes, no one had really thought about it this way. And I think it's a very powerful statement about the actual nature of the business cycle and what this particular piece of analysis brings to our thinking about business cycles, the idea that there are endogenous forces in the economy that can bring about an equilibrium that's different from the exogenously given potential GDP. Let me just emphasise that this is just one example of how a recession can emerge, but it's a particularly important example. Have a look at this chart, which shows real gross private domestic investment for the United States economy. We've seen a few of these charts before. Remember that these shaded areas represent periods of recession, so contractionary output gaps. You don't have to look all that closely to see a very systematic pattern going on here. Prior to recessions, nearly always leading up to the recession, we get investment peaking and then dropping. This is exactly what our previous analysis showed, that these falls in investment can be responsible for contractionary output gaps. They're not the only reason we can get contractionary output gaps, and we'll discuss others as we go through this material. But Keynes himself was very keen to emphasise the important role played by planned investment, and certainly when you look at the economic data like this one, it's pretty hard to not conclude that changes to planned investment are certainly going to be a very important part of the reason why economies find themselves in recession. And the framework that we've been developing, this basic Keynesian model, now provides us with a very systematic way of understanding why that might be the case. All right, let's look at a different sort of exogenous change now, a completely different sort of exogenous change. Let's suppose for some reason we get an increase in the exogenous component of consumption. For whatever reason, it's exogenous, we don't know what the reason is, but for whatever reason, households have decided collectively that they're going to increase this part of their consumption expenditure. What might that reason be? Well, who knows, but it might be that households, for whatever reason, are feeling more optimistic about the future and decide that this might be a good time to increase their expenditure. For whatever reason, let's just assume that something like this has happened. What impact will this have on the economy? Again, I want to start with a situation where the economy is at its potential GDP. So our initial equilibrium can be illustrated either by point A, equality between withdrawals and planned injections, or point A prime, where the planned aggregate expenditure line cuts the 45-degree line. All right, for whatever reason, we now have this increase in exogenous consumption. What does that do to this model? Well, it's going to show up in the consumption function, fairly obviously. So the economy's consumption function shifts up. You can really see how this is an exogenous shift in consumption. At potential GDP, household consumption used to be there. Without income having changed, households now wish to increase their consumption. So it's an exogenous change in consumption. It's not been caused by a change in income, it's been caused by other factors. Now the interesting question is, how is this possible? How is it that households have increased their consumption if their income has not increased? What makes this possible is presumably that households have found the funds they need to finance that increase of investment from other sources. For example, they may have withdrawn money from their savings accounts, and that has implications for withdrawals. And let's suppose that's what's happened. It's probably the easiest way to tell this story. Households have withdrawn funds from their savings accounts in order to finance this exogenous increase in consumption. So saving has decreased for this exogenous reason. And if saving has decreased for this exogenous reason, then the economy's overall levels of withdrawals have also decreased. So the withdrawal schedule will shift downwards. The final part of the story is to remember that consumption is a component of planned aggregate expenditure. So if the consumption function has shifted up, so also has planned aggregate expenditure. So if we go back to this withdrawal schedule, the relevant point on the withdrawal schedule is now point B. Straight away you can see we're no longer in equilibrium. The economy's withdrawals are now below the economy's planned injections. In terms of planned aggregate expenditure, we're now at B prime. We have more planned aggregate expenditure, even though the economy's GDP is unchanged, it's still at Y star. Again, you're now looking clearly at a disequilibrium. This is a disequilibrium where there has been an unexpected increase in planned aggregate expenditure. Firms are going to be finding that their inventories are unexpectedly declining. Firms will respond by boosting production, so the economy's GDP will increase. Now, what we're talking about here is an increase of GDP above potential GDP, but remember that's possible, at least in the short run, if firms hire workers much more overtime, for example, or if firms run their factories 24 hours a day instead of 12 hours a day, you can push GDP above potential. Incomes in the economy will be increasing. There's more GDP, there's more income. What does an increase in income do? It stimulates more withdrawals, so we start to see that showing up as a movement up and along the withdrawal schedule. It stimulates more consumption. It leads to more planned aggregate expenditure. We've told this story before. It leads to a new equilibrium. And let's call this new equilibrium YE1, and what we have here is the creation of an expansionary output gap. So again, planned aggregate expenditure has been the key. Again, we have our exogenous potential GDP unchanged, but we have our actual equilibrium GDP being endogenously determined within the model, in this case increasing as a result of an exogenous change, a change in this example in household consumption behaviour. So what we have here is a pretty complete explanation of the existence of business cycles, complete in the sense that we now understand through this framework the importance of planned aggregate expenditure in generating the business cycle. That should planned aggregate expenditure decrease, that can cause the economy's equilibrium GDP to fall and lead to a contractionary output gap. Should planned aggregate expenditure increase, you might end up in the opposite situation with the creation of an expansionary output gap. So let me just summarise this process for you. I think the easiest way to always use this framework is to identify your initial equilibrium. And our initial equilibrium will be, my apologies, there's a typo there. Planned aggregate expenditure equals GDP, or planned injections equals withdrawals. That may or may not correspond to potential GDP. Often in these analyses, just from an analytical point of view, it's convenient to assume you start with potential GDP, but it's not necessarily the case. And that's an equilibrium, so if nothing changes, that is where the economy itself will stay. What's interesting in this framework is to introduce an exogenous change. There can be various types of exogenous changes. It might be an exogenous change to one of the components of planned injections, either planned investment, exports, or government spending. We focused in this lecture on planned investment, but the same sort of analysis holds for the other two components of planned injections as well. As an exercise, you might like to convince yourself of that. Other things can change though. There could be changes in exogenous consumption, as we've analysed. Imports might have an exogenous component, that could change. Taxes might have an exogenous component, that could change as well. All of those changes are likely to affect household consumption. So we have a framework that starts in equilibrium, we then introduce an exogenous change and we see what happens next. What happens next is there'll be a shift in planned aggregate expenditure, that is in the planned aggregate expenditure schedule itself. There'll be a situation of disequilibrium created. Now, the important point about disequilibrium is that it's associated with unintended changes in inventories. Following on from that is the very important assumption in this framework that firms, when they observe those unintended changes in inventories, take that as a signal that they need to adjust production. They need to adjust production because they don't want to have these unintended change in inventories. It's a signal that they've gotten their production wrong. The change in production, of course, is equivalent to a change in the economy's GDP. Remember that that's a change in income. Production and income are two different words for the same thing at the level of the macroeconomy. That's going to lead to what is sometimes called induced, or if you like, endogenous changes to consumption and withdrawals, and that's part of the transition process to a new equilibrium. And then we move to a new equilibrium. Where planned aggregate expenditure is once again equal to GDP, planned injections once again equal to withdrawals. And it may or may not correspond to potential GDP. Certainly if we started at potential GDP and there is an exogenous change, where you end up is not going to be equivalent to potential GDP. And so we get the creation of output gaps. So it's a very rich but very systematic story about why it is that we see periods where economies have either contractionary or expansionary output gaps. It's a framework that very clearly identifies for us what we mean by macroeconomic equilibrium, and even more clearly identifies for us the circumstances in which that equilibrium might change, and moreover enables us to understand why it is that the economy in the short run might find itself with a situation where its actual GDP can be different from its potential GDP.